My grandpa's will tore my family apart, but his real gift was hidden in the attic. The funeral home was suffocating, with its beige walls and artificial flowers that did nothing to mask the smell of antiseptic and grief. I stood there in my uncomfortable black suit, watching as relatives I hadn't seen in years offered hollow condolences to my mother Eleanor and father Robert. My grandfather William had been the patriarch of our family, a man whose presence was as large as his collection of vintage books and even larger stories. Now all that remained was a closed casket and the awkward shuffle of family members who suddenly remembered we existed. My cousin Brandon, of course, was playing the part of the grieving grandson to perfection. With his perfectly coiffed hair and designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, he moved through the crowd with practiced ease. Brandon had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of our extended family. While I struggled through community college and worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, Brandon had graduated from an Ivy League university and was already climbing the corporate ladder at some prestigious firm that nobody in our family actually understood. As the service concluded and we made our way to the family lawyer's office for the will reading, I couldn't help but reflect on my relationship with Grandpa William. He had been my anchor throughout my chaotic childhood. When my parents were fighting, I would sneak over to his house where he would teach me how to identify birds in his backyard or show me his collection of antique maps. He never treated me like the disappointment my extended family seemed to think I was. Instead, he saw potential in me that I couldn't always see in myself. The lawyer's office was everything you'd expect. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, and an atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions. My Aunt Carol, Brandon's mother, was already making passive-aggressive comments about how Brandon had been Grandpa's favorite, while my Uncle Daniel nodded along with everything she said. My parents sat stoically, holding hands but not looking at each other. Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer for as long as anyone could remember, cleared his throat and began reading the will. The standard bequests came first, small amounts to distant relatives, donations to charities Grandpa had supported throughout his life. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. To my beloved grandson Brandon, Mr. Harrison read, adjusting his glasses, I leave my entire estate, including the family home, all financial assets, and the entirety of my personal belongings. The room went silent. I felt my stomach drop as I processed what I had just heard. My entire inheritance was nothing? Not even a sentimental item? Not the vintage watch Grandpa had promised me when I turned 16? Not the collection of first edition books we had read together? My mother squeezed my hand so tightly I thought my fingers might break. My father's face had turned a shade of red I had only seen once before, when he discovered his prized fishing rod had been borrowed and never returned. Brandon, meanwhile, had the audacity to look surprised, as if he hadn't known this was coming. He put on a show of modesty, saying something about how he would make sure everyone had access to the house and Grandpa's things, but his eyes told a different story. They were gleaming with victory. I sat there stunned as Mr. Harrison continued reading, but nothing else pertained to me. No mention of the promises Grandpa had made, no acknowledgement of our special bond. Just nothing. As we filed out of the office, the whispers began. Carol was already talking about how they would remodel the house, modernizing all the features that had made it Grandpa's. Brandon was discussing investment strategies with my Uncle Daniel, as if the money were already in his bank account. My parents pulled me aside, their expressions a mixture of pity and disappointment. Maybe there's a reason he did it this way, my mother said, though even she didn't seem to believe her own words. A reason? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. The reason is that Brandon has always been the favorite, and I've always been the afterthought. My father sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Jordan, don't make a scene. We'll figure something out. But I knew there was nothing to figure out. The will was clear. The man who had been my champion, my confidant, my biggest supporter, had left me with nothing. And as I watched Brandon accept congratulations from family members who had ignored me for years, I felt something inside me break. The worst part wasn't the financial loss, it was the betrayal. Grandpa William had known how much I was struggling, how much I needed help, and yet he had chosen to give everything to the cousin who needed nothing at all. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the grandpa I knew. The grandpa I knew would never have abandoned me like this. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I made a decision. I needed to go back to his house one last time, not to say goodbye, but to understand why. The days following the will reading were a blur of anger and confusion. My family had fractured into two distinct camps, those who supported Brandon's windfall and those, like my parents and me, who couldn't comprehend the injustice of it all. Family dinners became battlegrounds of passive-aggressive comments and forced smiles. Carol and Daniel paraded Brandon around like a trophy, while my parents and I sat in uncomfortable silence, our presence barely acknowledged. What hurt most was how quickly everyone seemed to forget the man they were supposedly mourning. Within a week, Carol had already hired an interior decorator to update Grandpa's house. She spoke of replacing the worn leather armchair where Grandpa had read me countless stories with something more modern. She planned to convert his beloved library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, into a home theater system for Brandon. Each time I heard these plans, a fresh wave of anger washed over me. These weren't just objects being replaced, they were memories being erased. And Brandon, the supposed favorite grandson, seemed to have no attachment to any of it. He was more interested in the property value and investment potential than in preserving the legacy of the man who had raised him. My parents tried to mediate, suggesting that perhaps Grandpa had known Brandon would take better care of the assets, or that there might be some logical explanation none of us could see. But their hearts weren't in it, and I could see the disappointment in their eyes. They had always defended Grandpa's decisions, but even they couldn't rationalize this one. The breaking point came during a family dinner at my parents' house 2 weeks after the funeral. Carol was holding court, detailing the renovation plans with the enthusiasm of someone describing a lottery win. "The kitchen is completely outdated," she said, gesturing with her wine glass. "We're thinking marble countertops, top-of-the-line appliances, maybe even a wine cellar where that dusty old pantry is." "That dusty old pantry," I interrupted, my voice tight with anger, "is where Grandpa stored his homemade preserves. He spent every fall canning vegetables from his garden." Carol waved dismissively. "Oh, that's sweet, but really, who has time for all that anymore? Brandon needs a functional space for entertaining clients." Brandon nodded in agreement, barely looking up from his phone. "The property value will increase significantly with the right updates." I couldn't take it anymore. Does it matter to either of you that this was Grandpa's home? That he lived there for over 50 years? That every room holds memories? Everyone went silent. My mother shot me a warning look, but I ignored her. "Jordan, don't be difficult," Carol said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We're not erasing memories. We're just updating the house for the current century." "You're erasing him," I shot back, my voice rising. "You're turning his home into some sterile showcase for Brandon's success." Brandon finally looked up from his phone, his expression annoyed. "Look, I appreciate that you're upset, but this is my property now. Grandpa left it to me for a reason. Maybe he knew I would appreciate it more." The implication hung in the air, that I, the struggling college dropout, couldn't possibly appreciate what Grandpa had built. That I, the perpetual disappointment, wasn't worthy of his legacy. I stood up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Jordan, sit down," my father said, his voice low and warning. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I can't listen to this anymore. You're all treating Grandpa like he was just some rich old man who left behind stuff. But he was so much more than that. He was kind and thoughtful, and he loved this family. He wouldn't have wanted this." As I turned to leave, Carol called after me. "Don't be so dramatic. You're just upset you didn't get anything. Maybe if you had made something of yourself like Brandon, Grandpa would have left you something too." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I walked out without responding, slamming the door behind me. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The injustice of it all was suffocating. Brandon, who had barely visited Grandpa in his final years, who had treated him like a distant acquaintance rather than family, had received everything. And I, who had been there through his illness, who had sat by his hospital bed, who had cherished every moment with him, had been completely disregarded. That night, I made a decision. I needed to go back to Grandpa's house one last time before Brandon and his parents descended upon it with their interior decorators and renovation plans. I needed to say goodbye in my own way, on my own terms. I needed to walk through each room one last time, touch the objects that held so many memories, and somehow find a way to accept this cruel twist of fate. The next morning, I called my mother to let her know my plans. "I just want to get a few things," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sentimental stuff. I know the will didn't leave me anything, but I thought maybe Brandon wouldn't mind if I took some small mementos." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I think that's a good idea. I'll talk to Carol. Just be careful, Jordan. Don't expect too much." "I won't," I promised, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or myself. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Grandpa William had been many things, but cruel had never been one of them. The man who had stayed up all night helping me study for my high school exams, who had taught me how to change a tire and bake a perfect apple pie, who had never once made me feel like I was anything less than special, that man wouldn't have intentionally hurt me like this. And as I prepared to visit his house for what I thought would be the last time, I held on to a small flicker of hope that perhaps there was more to this story than what the will had revealed. Perhaps there was an explanation, a reason, a message I had missed. I had no idea how right I would turn out to be. The drive to Grandpa's house was filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. Every landmark along the way triggered a memory. The corner store where he used to buy me ice cream after school, the park where he taught me to ride a bike, the library where we had spent countless Saturday mornings. Each memory was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what I had lost. When I finally pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. A large for sale sign was already staked in the front lawn, with a smaller under contract sign hanging beneath it. Carol hadn't wasted any time. The thought of strangers living in Grandpa's house, changing everything that made it special, was almost too much to bear. I took a deep breath and walked to the front door, my key feeling foreign in my hand. This would be the last time I would use it. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar entryway, with its worn wooden floors and the antique mirror where Grandpa had taught me to tie a tie. The air still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and lemon polish, a scent that had always meant safety and love to me. The house was eerily quiet, filled with moving boxes in various stages of being packed. Carol and Brandon had already started sorting through Grandpa's belongings, their efficiency a stark contrast to the care with which he had curated his life. I could see labeled boxes destined for donation, storage, or the trash, each one a small death of a memory. I wandered through the house, my fingers trailing along the familiar surfaces. In the living room, I paused at the fireplace mantel where family photos had always been displayed. They were gone now, packed away somewhere, leaving dusty outlines on the wood. I could picture each one in my mind. Grandpa holding me as a newborn, my parents' wedding photo, Brandon and me as children playing in the backyard. The kitchen was next, and I found myself opening cupboards and drawers, touching the utensils and dishes that had been part of countless family meals. I remembered sitting at the large wooden table, doing homework while Grandpa prepared dinner, humming old jazz tunes as he chopped vegetables. He had been a terrible singer, but a wonderful cook, and the kitchen had always been the heart of the home. Upstairs, the bedrooms were already mostly packed. Grandpa's room felt the most violated, his personal items sorted into boxes with an efficiency that bordered on disrespectful. His closet, once filled with his signature flannel shirts and worn sweaters, was nearly empty. On his nightstand, his favorite reading glasses lay abandoned, as if he had just set them down and might return at any moment. It was in his study that I found myself lingering the longest. This had been our special place, where he had taught me to play chess and where we had spent hours discussing books and ideas. The bookshelves were still mostly full, and I ran my fingers along the spines of books we had read together, the titles bringing back vivid memories of our conversations. As I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of his intellectual life, I noticed something odd. One of the books on the highest shelf was pushed back slightly, as if it had been returned hastily. It was a collection of poetry by Robert Frost, one of Grandpa's favorites. I remembered him reading The Road Not Taken to me on my high school graduation day, telling me that the path less traveled was often the one that led to the most interesting destinations. I pulled the book from the shelf, intending to keep it as a memento. As I opened it, a small envelope fell out, fluttering to the floor. My heart raced as I picked it up. It was addressed to me in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, with a simple instruction: "Do not open until you are alone." My hands trembled as I slipped the envelope into my pocket. I quickly finished gathering a few small items: a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a worn leather journal, a handful of photographs from the bottom of a desk drawer. Each item felt like a small victory, a piece of the man I had loved so much that I could keep for myself. As I was about to leave, I noticed something else that seemed out of place. A small ladder, usually kept in the garage for changing light bulbs, was propped against the wall in the hallway, directly below the attic door. The attic door, which was slightly ajar. The attic had always been Grandpa's domain, a place where he stored treasures and memories, but rarely allowed anyone else to enter. He had always been mysterious about it, telling me that some things were meant to be discovered at the right time. As a child, I had imagined it filled with magical objects and secret passages. Now, with the ladder beckoning and the letter burning a hole in my pocket, I felt an irresistible pull to investigate. I glanced at my watch, realizing I had been in the house longer than I had planned. Carol or Brandon could arrive at any moment. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to leave before I was discovered and the growing curiosity about what the attic might hold. The letter in my pocket felt like a sign, a permission slip from beyond the grave to explore the one place in the house that had always been off limits. Making a decision, I positioned the ladder more securely beneath the attic door and began to climb. The wooden rungs creaked under my weight, protesting the intrusion. As I reached the top and pushed the door open wider, a cloud of dust motes danced in the beam of light from my phone's flashlight. The attic was exactly as I had imagined it, filled with boxes and furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts of a forgotten time. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cedar, a scent that transported me back to childhood visits to antique stores with Grandpa. I stepped carefully onto the wooden floor, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was larger than I had expected, with a small window at the far end that cast a golden glow on the dust particles floating in the air. It was in this glow that I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A small wooden desk, exactly like the one Grandpa had in his study, positioned to face the window. Drawn by an invisible force, I made my way across the attic, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. On the desk sat a single object, a small, intricately carved wooden box with a note attached to its lid. The note was in Grandpa's handwriting, and it read simply, "For Jordan, when you're ready to understand." With trembling hands, I opened the letter from my pocket, my curiosity overriding my earlier promise to wait until I was alone. As I unfolded it, I had no idea that the words written on that page would not only change my understanding of Grandpa's will, but would also reveal a secret that would alter the course of my family's future forever. The letter in my hands felt like a connection to the past, a tangible piece of the man I had loved and lost. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the yellowed paper, the creases soft from age. Grandpa's distinctive handwriting sprawled across the page, familiar and comforting even in this strange setting. "My dear Jordan," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and you have discovered the path I have laid out for you. First, let me apologize for the pain my will has caused you. I know it must have felt like a betrayal, like I had abandoned you when you needed me most. Nothing could be further from the truth. I paused, my eyes scanning the words again and again. An apology? A path? What was he talking about? I continued reading, my heart racing with a mixture of confusion and hope. The truth is, my decision to leave everything to Brandon was not what it appeared to be. It was a test, not just for him, but for our entire family. I have watched for years as Brandon's sense of entitlement grew, as his manipulation of those around him became more sophisticated. I have seen how he uses charm to disguise his selfishness, how he presents a facade of success while taking shortcuts and compromising his integrity. The letter went on to describe instances of Brandon's dishonesty that I had never known about, times he had taken credit for others' work, situations where he had lied to get ahead, even an incident where he had allegedly sabotaged a colleague's project to secure a promotion. Each revelation was more shocking than the last, painting a picture of my cousin that was vastly different from the golden child image our family had embraced. I needed to see how Brandon would handle true responsibility, Grandpa continued. I needed to know if he would honor my legacy or if he would succumb to his worst instincts. Most importantly, I needed to protect you and the family from the potential harm he might cause if left unchecked. I sank onto the dusty floor of the attic, the letter clutched in my hands. This couldn't be real. Grandpa had always been fond of Brandon, praising his accomplishments and holding him up as an example for me to follow. Had it all been an act? Had he seen through Brandon's facade all along? The letter provided an answer to that question as well. I know what you're thinking, Jordan. You're wondering why I praised Brandon if I knew the truth about his character. Sometimes, the best way to learn about someone is to let them believe they are not being watched. Sometimes, you must allow people to reveal themselves through their own choices, without the influence of your expectations. Grandpa went on to explain that he had set up a series of tests for Brandon hidden within the terms of the will itself. The will contains several conditions that Brandon must meet to actually inherit the estate. These conditions are designed to reveal his true character. If he fails to meet them, the inheritance will be redirected to you as my alternate beneficiary. I couldn't believe what I was reading. All this time, I had thought Grandpa had abandoned me, when in fact, he had been protecting me and setting up a way to ensure that the right person inherited his legacy. But why hadn't he just told me? Why put me through this pain and confusion? As if reading my mind, Grandpa addressed this directly in the letter. You're probably wondering why I didn't just tell you all of this directly. The answer is simple. I needed your reactions to be genuine. I needed Brandon and the rest of the family to believe that you had been completely cut out, because only then would their true nature be revealed. Sometimes, my dear Jordan, the most valuable lessons are learned in the darkest moments. The letter then directed my attention to the wooden box on the desk. Inside this box, you will find the evidence you need, along with instructions for the final phase of my plan.
I have spent years gathering information, not just about Brandon, but about others in our family who have enabled his behavior. The truth is often uncomfortable, but it is always necessary. With trembling hands, I reached for the wooden box. It was heavier than it looked, with intricate carvings of trees and birds along its edges. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and small objects wrapped in tissue paper. On top of everything was another note from Grandpa. Start with the large envelope, it instructed. The rest will make sense once you understand the full context. I opened the large envelope, my hands shaking with anticipation. Inside was a thick file of documents, bank statements, emails, legal papers, and detailed notes in Grandpa's handwriting. As I began to read, a picture started to form that was even more disturbing than I had imagined. The documents revealed that Brandon had been embezzling money from the company where he worked, using complex schemes to hide his tracks. There were emails between him and his accomplices discussing how to cover their tracks and deflect suspicion. There were bank records showing large, unexplained deposits into Brandon's accounts, timed perfectly with financial discrepancies at his company. But that wasn't all. The file also contained evidence that Brandon had been manipulating our family for years, pitting people against each other to maintain his status as the golden child. There were recordings of conversations where he lied about me to other family members, spreading rumors and misinformation to ensure I remained the family disappointment. As I dug deeper into the box, I found more evidence. Photographs of Brandon with people I didn't recognize, accompanied by notes indicating they were involved in questionable business dealings. There were copies of legal documents showing that Brandon had been sued by former business partners for fraud, though he had managed to keep these proceedings quiet from the family. Perhaps most disturbing of all was a small journal at the bottom of the box, filled with Grandpa's observations about Brandon's behavior over the years. The entries painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly concerned about his grandson's moral compass, who had tried on multiple occasions to guide Brandon toward a more ethical path, only to be met with manipulation and deceit. I tried to talk to him about honesty and integrity, one entry read. He smiled and nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he was just telling me what I wanted to hear. He has become so good at wearing masks that I'm not sure he even knows who he really is anymore. As I sat there in the dusty attic, surrounded by evidence of my cousin's betrayal, I felt a mix of emotions: anger at Brandon for his deception, sadness for the family that had been so thoroughly manipulated, but also a profound sense of gratitude for my grandfather's wisdom and foresight. He had known exactly what he was doing, creating a plan that would not only protect the family's assets, but also reveal the truth about Brandon's character. But as I continued to explore the contents of the box, I discovered that there was more to Grandpa's plan than simply exposing Brandon. Tucked away in a small compartment was a set of keys and a note that would lead me to the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that would not only change my understanding of the inheritance, but would alter the course of my life in ways I could never have imagined. The keys in my hand felt heavy with significance. 3 of them attached to a simple metal ring, each one distinct from the others. One was an ornate brass key, the kind that might open an old chest or safe deposit box. Another was a modern electronic key card, like those used in hotels or secure buildings.
The third was a small silver key that looked like it might belong to a safety deposit box or a post office box. The note accompanying the keys was written in Grandpa's familiar script, but this time there was an urgency to his words that hadn't been present in the previous letter. "Jordan," it began, "what you have discovered so far is only the beginning. The evidence in the box is damning, but it's not the complete picture. There is one final piece of the puzzle you need to understand, and it will change everything you think you know about our family's history and your place in it." The note went on to explain that each key corresponded to a different location, each one holding a piece of the final revelation. The brass key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, downtown branch. The key card will give you access to a storage unit at Secure Store on Route 9. The silver key opens a post office box at the main post office. Grandpa had provided detailed instructions for each location, including box numbers and access codes. But what caught my attention was the order in which he wanted me to visit them. "Start with the post office box," he wrote. "What you find there will provide context for the other locations. Then visit the storage unit, and finally the safe deposit box. Each location builds on the previous one, so please follow this order exactly." I looked at my watch, realizing how much time had passed since I had arrived at Grandpa's house. Carol or Brandon could show up at any moment. I quickly gathered the contents of the wooden box, placing everything back inside except for the keys and the note. I closed the lid of the box, leaving it exactly as I had found it, and made my way back down the ladder, my mind racing with questions. As I stepped onto the hallway floor, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Panicked, I quickly returned the ladder to the corner where I had found it and closed the attic door, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the few mementos I had collected earlier and rushed to the front door, slipping out just as I heard the back door open. Once in my car, I took a moment to compose myself, my hands still shaking from adrenaline and the weight of what I had discovered. The post office would be closing soon, so I decided to head there first, following Grandpa's instructions. The main post office was bustling with activity when I arrived, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of Grandpa's attic. I found the post office box without difficulty, my hands trembling slightly as I inserted the small silver key. Inside was a single manila envelope addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting. I took the envelope to a quiet corner of the lobby, my curiosity warring with my apprehension. What could possibly be left to reveal after everything I had already learned? As I opened the envelope, I had no idea that the contents would not only shock me to my core, but would also fundamentally change my understanding of my own identity. Inside the envelope was a birth certificate, my birth certificate, and another document that looked like some kind of legal amendment. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The birth certificate seemed normal enough, listing my parents' names and my date of birth. But the second document, dated when I was 5 years old, was a legal guardianship transfer, signed by a judge. As I read through the document, my world began to tilt on its axis. According to this paper, my parents had voluntarily transferred legal guardianship of me to Grandpa William, citing financial difficulties and an inability to provide adequate care. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was a handwritten note attached to the document, written by my mother. William, it read, "We know you will give Jordan the life we cannot. Please love him as your own and never let him know the sacrifices we have made. This is the greatest gift we can give our son, the gift of a father who can provide for him in ways we never could." I sank onto one of the hard plastic benches, the documents clutched in my hands. This couldn't be true. My parents had always been there for me, through thick and thin. They had struggled financially at times, but they had never indicated that they had given up guardianship of me. And Grandpa had never mentioned anything about being my legal guardian. As I sat there, trying to process this revelation, I remembered something that had never made sense to me. Why Grandpa had always been the one to attend parent-teacher conferences. Why he had been the one to sign permission slips for school trips. Why he had been the one to make decisions about my education and health care. At the time, I had assumed it was because my parents worked long hours or because Grandpa was simply more involved. Now, I wondered if there had been a more formal arrangement all along. The note from Grandpa that had accompanied the keys had mentioned that what I would discover would change my understanding of my place in the family. This revelation certainly qualified. But why had he kept this secret? Why had my parents never told me the truth? With more questions than answers, I made my way to the storage unit, my mind reeling from what I had learned. The storage unit was in a climate-controlled facility, clean and well-maintained. The electronic keycard granted me access to Unit 7B, which was larger than I had expected. Inside, the space was filled with carefully labeled boxes and furniture covered in protective sheets. On a table in the center of the unit sat a laptop computer and a folder with my name on it. I opened the folder to find another note from Grandpa. "Jordan," it began, "what you discovered at the post office explains much, but there is still more you need to understand. The documents you found are true. Your parents did transfer legal guardianship to me when you were 5 years old. But what you don't know is why and what happened afterward." The note went on to explain that my parents had fallen on hard times after my father lost his job and my mother became ill with a condition that required expensive treatment. They wanted to provide for you, but they simply couldn't afford to do so and pay for your mother's medical care. I offered to help financially, but your father was too proud to accept charity. The guardianship arrangement was his idea, a way for me to provide for you without it feeling like a handout.
Grandpa explained that he had always intended to transfer guardianship back to my parents once their situation improved. But as time went on, we all found a rhythm that worked. Your parents remained actively involved in your life, but I handled the financial and legal responsibilities. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it was born of love and necessity. The note then directed my attention to the laptop. On this computer, you will find a series of video journals I recorded over the years. They explain everything in more detail and will help you understand the decisions I made regarding my will. Start with the video labeled Part 1. I opened the laptop and found a folder containing several video files, each labeled with a part number. I clicked on Part 1, my heart pounding with anticipation. Grandpa's face filled the screen, looking older and more frail than I remembered him, but with the same warm eyes and gentle smile I had known my entire life. "Jordan, my dear boy," he began, his voice exactly as I remembered it. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you've begun the journey I've laid out for you. First, let me apologize for the secrets I've kept. I know this must be confusing and perhaps even hurtful, but I promise you, everything I did was out of love for you and our family." As I listened to Grandpa explain the circumstances surrounding my guardianship, I felt a mix of emotions: sadness for what my parents had gone through, gratitude for Grandpa's support, and confusion about why this had all been kept from me. But as the video continued, I realized that this revelation was just the beginning of something much larger. "There's something else you need to know, Jordan," Grandpa said, his expression growing serious. "Something about our family's history that will change how you see everything. The final piece of this puzzle is in the safe deposit box at the bank. What you find there will not only explain my decisions about the will, but will also reveal your true inheritance, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of who you are and where you come from." As the video ended, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything I had learned. My entire life, I had believed one version of my history, only to discover that the reality was something entirely different. And yet, through it all, one thing remained constant: Grandpa's love and his determination to protect me, even from beyond the grave. With a sense of both trepidation and anticipation, I packed up the laptop and the folder, making sure to leave everything else exactly as I have found it. There was one final stop on this journey of discovery: the safe deposit box at the bank, and somehow I knew that what I found there would be the most shocking revelation of all. The bank was quiet as I entered, the air-conditioned interior a welcome relief from the afternoon heat. I approached the counter, my hand still clutching the brass key that Grandpa had left for me. The bank employee, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, escorted me to the vault where the safe deposit boxes were kept. As she inserted her key and I inserted mine, I felt a sense of ceremony, as if I were participating in a ritual that had been planned long ago. The box slid out smoothly, and I carried it to a private viewing room, my heart pounding with anticipation. Inside the metal box were several items, each one carefully wrapped or enclosed. On top was another note from Grandpa, his handwriting as familiar as ever. "Jordan," it began, "if you followed my instructions, you now know about the guardianship arrangement and the reasons behind it. But there is still one piece of the puzzle you need to understand, one that will change everything you think you know about our family and your place in it." The note went on to explain that the guardianship arrangement had been just one part of a larger plan, a plan that Grandpa had put in place to protect not just me, but a family secret that had been kept for generations. "What you need to understand, Jordan, is that our family is not what it appears to be. We have a history that has been deliberately obscured, a legacy that has been protected at all costs. The contents of this box will reveal that legacy, but I warn you, it may be difficult to accept at first." With trembling hands, I unwrapped the first item, a leather-bound journal that looked ancient. As I opened it, I realized it was a diary, written in a flowing script that was similar to Grandpa's, but clearly from an earlier time. The first entry was dated 1923, and it was signed by a name I didn't recognize, Jonathan Whitmore. As I began to read, I realized that this was not just any diary. It was the journal of my great-grandfather, a man I knew almost nothing about, except that he had died young, leaving Grandpa William to be raised by his mother. But the journal revealed a very different story than the one I had been told. According to the journal, Jonathan Whitmore had not died young. Instead, he had been forced to disappear, leaving behind his family and his identity to protect them from a dangerous situation. The journal detailed his involvement with a powerful organization that had turned against him, forcing him to choose between his family's safety and his own life. "They believe I have betrayed them," one entry read. "They have threatened my wife and son if I do not turn over the documents. I have no choice but to disappear, to create a new life elsewhere. It is the only way to protect them." The journal went on to describe how Jonathan had orchestrated his own death, creating a new identity and starting over in a different part of the country. But he had maintained contact with his son, Grandpa William, through a series of intermediaries and coded messages. The most shocking revelation came in the final entries of the journal, where Jonathan explained the nature of the documents that had caused his disappearance. They were not just any documents, they were evidence of a conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful people in the country, a conspiracy that, if exposed, would have far-reaching consequences. "I have entrusted the original documents to William," the final entry read. "He is still young, but I know he will understand their importance when the time is right. I have also created a backup, a safety net that will ensure the truth can be revealed if anything happens to me or if the documents are lost or destroyed." As I finished reading the journal, my mind reeled with the implications. My great-grandfather hadn't died young. He had been forced to abandon his family to protect them. Grandpa William had grown up with this secret, knowing the truth but unable to share it with anyone. And somewhere there were documents that could expose a conspiracy that had been hidden for decades. I reached for the next item in the safe deposit box, a large envelope labeled "For Jordan's Eyes Only." Inside was a collection of documents, some yellowed with age, others more recent. As I began to examine them, I realized with a shock that these were the documents my great-grandfather had mentioned, the evidence of the conspiracy he had been involved in. There were photographs, financial records, meeting minutes, and detailed notes describing illegal activities involving powerful politicians, business leaders, and government officials. It was the kind of evidence that could ruin careers and even topple governments, and it had been hidden in my family for generations, passed down from father to son, each one entrusted with the dangerous knowledge it contained. But as I continued to examine the documents, I realized there was more to the story than just a conspiracy. Tucked away in a side pocket of the envelope was a smaller envelope, this one labeled "The Truth About Your Inheritance." Inside was a letter from Grandpa William, along with a set of legal documents that would change my understanding of everything. "Jordan," the letter began, "by now you must be wondering why I've shared this family secret with you and what it has to do with my will. The truth is, everything is connected. The conspiracy your great-grandfather uncovered is still active today, and the people involved are more powerful than ever." Grandpa went on to explain that Brandon, my cousin, had become entangled with this organization, drawn in by the promise of wealth and power. I discovered his involvement by accident, but once I knew, I understood that I had to act. Brandon's ambition and lack of moral compass made him the perfect target for their recruitment. They have been using him to gain access to our family, believing that we still possess the original documents your great-grandfather had. The legal documents accompanying the letter revealed the shocking truth about my inheritance. Grandpa William had not just left me a backup plan in case Brandon failed to meet the conditions of the will, he had left me something much more valuable. "Jordan, the real inheritance I've left you is not money or property. It's knowledge and the power to do what's right. The documents in this box are copies of the originals, but I've also left you the location of the originals, along with instructions for how to use them to expose the conspiracy and protect our family." The documents revealed that Grandpa had set up a trust in my name, funded with assets that had been hidden from the public for decades. These assets were not just financial, they included information, contacts, and resources that would allow me to continue the work my great-grandfather had started, to expose the truth and hold those responsible accountable. But there was more. The documents also revealed that Grandpa had been working with a group of like-minded individuals, descendants of others who had been affected by the conspiracy. Together, they had been gathering evidence and planning a way to expose the truth without putting their families in danger. Jordan, you are now part of this legacy, Grandpa's letter continued. You have the knowledge and the resources to make a difference, but you also have a choice. You can walk away, live a normal life, and let someone else carry this burden. Or you can embrace your inheritance, not just the financial aspects, but the responsibility that comes with it. As I sat there in the quiet room of the bank, surrounded by documents that revealed a family history I had never known, I understood what Grandpa had done. He had not just left me an inheritance, he had left me a mission, and he had given me the tools to carry it out. The will, the conditions, the elaborate plan to test Brandon's character, it was all part of a larger strategy to protect the family's legacy while ensuring that the truth would eventually come to light. Grandpa had known that Brandon would fail the test, that his greed and ambition would lead him to make choices that would expose his true character. And when that happened, I would be in a position to step in and claim not just the family's assets, but the responsibility that came with them. As I gathered the documents and prepared to leave the bank, I felt a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. My life, which had seemed directionless and disappointing, suddenly had meaning. I was not just the struggling college dropout, the family disappointment. I was the keeper of a legacy, the guardian of a truth that could change the world. But I also knew that the path ahead would not be easy. Exposing a conspiracy this powerful would be dangerous, and there would be people who would do anything to protect their secrets. I would need to be careful, strategic, and brave. As I stepped out of the bank and into the bright sunlight, I made a decision. I would embrace my inheritance, not just the financial aspects, but the responsibility that came with it. I would honor Grandpa's trust in me, and I would continue the work he had started. But first, there was something I needed to do: confront my family with the truth about Brandon and begin the process of reclaiming the legacy that was rightfully mine. The drive back to my parents' house was filled with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The documents from the safe deposit box were carefully secured in a locked briefcase on the passenger seat, their contents weighing heavily on my mind. I had spent the past hour at a nearby cafe, reading through everything one more time, formulating a plan for how to handle the situation with my family. My parents had called while I was at the bank, asking me to come over for a family meeting. Carol had apparently been demanding that I return the sentimental items I had taken from Grandpa's house, claiming they were part of Brandon's inheritance. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. This would be my opportunity to reveal the truth. When I arrived at my parents' house, the tension was palpable. Carol and Brandon were already there, sitting stiffly on the couch while my parents hovered awkwardly nearby. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentments and long-held grievances. "Jordan, thank you for coming," my mother said, her voice strained. "Carol has some concerns about the items you took from your grandfather's house." Carol didn't waste any time. Those items belonged to Brandon now. The will was very clear that everything was left to him. You had no right to take anything without permission. Brandon nodded in agreement, though he seemed more interested in his phone than in the conversation. "It's a matter of principle," he said, without looking up. "The will needs to be respected." I took a deep breath, centering myself before I began. "Actually, that's not entirely true. The will was more complicated than you think." Carol scoffed. "What are you talking about? We all heard the will. Everything was left to Brandon." "Not exactly," I said, pulling a document from my briefcase. "Grandpa included several conditions that Brandon had to meet to actually inherit the estate. Conditions that, as far as I can tell, he hasn't met." I handed the document to my father, who began to read it with a confused expression. It was a copy of the full will, including the addendum that contained the conditions Brandon was supposed to meet.
"What is this?" Carol asked, reaching for the document. "This can't be real. Our lawyer went over the will with us. There were no conditions." "That's because your lawyer only saw what Grandpa wanted him to see," I explained. "The full will was filed with the court, but Grandpa made arrangements to ensure that the conditions wouldn't be revealed unless Brandon failed to meet them." As my parents and Carol read through the document, their expressions changed from confusion to shock. The conditions were clear and specific. Brandon had to maintain his current job for at least 6 months. He had to donate a portion of the inheritance to charity, and most importantly, he had to undergo a financial audit to prove that he hadn't been engaging in any illegal activities. "These are ridiculous conditions," Carol sputtered. "No one would agree to these." "Grandpa was counting on that," I said calmly. "He knew that Brandon wouldn't meet the conditions, which is why he named me as the alternate beneficiary." Brandon finally looked up from his phone, his face pale. "This can't be legal. There's no way this is real." "It's very real," I said, pulling out another document. "And it gets even more interesting. Grandpa also left a letter explaining why he set up the will this way. Would you like me to read it?" Before anyone could respond, I began to read Grandpa's letter, the one that explained his concerns about Brandon's character and his desire to test him before entrusting him with the family's legacy. As I read, the room grew increasingly quiet, the only sound being my voice and the occasional gasp from Carol or my mother. When I finished reading, no one spoke for a long time. Carol looked as if she had seen a ghost, while my father stared at the documents in his hands with a dazed expression. Brandon, however, had a different reaction. His face was contorted with anger. "This is blackmail," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're trying to steal my inheritance." "I'm not stealing anything," I replied calmly. "Grandpa made his wishes very clear. The inheritance was always meant to go to the person who would honor his legacy, not the person who would exploit it for personal gain." Brandon stood up abruptly, knocking over a lamp in the process. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You've always been jealous of me, always trying to undermine my success." "Is that what you call success?" I asked, pulling out the evidence of his embezzlement and fraud. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying and cheating your way to the top." As I spread the documents on the coffee table, Carol's face went from pale to ashen. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Even my father, who had always defended Brandon, looked at his nephew with a mixture of disappointment and anger. "This can't be real," Carol whispered, shaking her head. "My son would never do these things." "The evidence is pretty clear," I said, pointing to bank statements and emails that detailed Brandon's illegal activities. "Grandpa knew about this. That's why he set up the will the way he did. He was trying to protect the family from the consequences of Brandon's actions." The room descended into chaos as everyone tried to process what they had learned. Carol alternated between denial and anger, while my parents struggled to reconcile the image of Brandon they had always held with the reality of his actions. Brandon himself remained silent, his face a mask of fury and fear. It was my father who finally broke the silence. "Jordan, where did you get all of this information?" I hesitated for a moment, deciding how much to reveal. I had already shared so much, but the full story of our family's history felt too big, too complex to drop on them all at once. "Grandpa left it for me," I said finally. "He knew this would happen, and he wanted me to have the tools to handle it." Carol looked at me with newfound suspicion. "What do you mean he left it for you? Why would he leave all of this to you and not to Brandon?" "Because he knew I would do the right thing," I said simply. "He knew that I would honor his legacy, not just the financial aspects, but the moral ones as well." As I spoke, I realized the truth in my own words. Grandpa hadn't just left me an inheritance, he had left me a responsibility. And in that moment, I understood what I needed to do next. "I think we all need some time to process this," I said, gathering the documents. "Brandon, I suggest you contact a lawyer. Carol, Daniel, you might want to do the same. The authorities will likely be involved." "What are you going to do?" Carol asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to do what Grandpa wanted me to do," I replied. "I'm going to protect our family's legacy, even if it means making some difficult choices." As I left my parents' house that evening, I felt a sense of closure mixed with anticipation. The confrontation had been difficult, but necessary. The truth was out, and now the process of healing could begin. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Brandon's actions came to light. The authorities were called, investigations were launched, and the family was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths. Brandon ultimately faced criminal charges for his fraudulent activities, while Carol and Daniel had to deal with the financial and emotional fallout of their son's actions. For my part, I assumed control of the family's assets, using them not just for my own benefit, but to honor Grandpa's legacy. I established a foundation in his name dedicated to supporting education and literacy programs, causes that had been important to him. But I also embraced the larger inheritance Grandpa had left me, the responsibility to continue the work he had started, to expose the conspiracy that had affected our family for generations. It was a daunting task, but one I felt prepared for, thanks to Grandpa's guidance and the resources he had provided. As I sat in Grandpa's study, now my study, surrounded by his books and mementos, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The will had torn my family apart, but it had also revealed the truth about Brandon, about our family's history, and about myself. Grandpa's real gift hadn't been the money or the property. It had been the knowledge and the opportunity to make a difference, to honor his legacy in a way that went far beyond material possessions. And as I looked out the window at the setting sun, I felt a sense of gratitude for the man who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had prepared me for this moment even when I didn't know it was coming. The road ahead would be challenging, but I was ready for it. I was no longer the family disappointment, the struggling college dropout. I was the keeper of a legacy, the guardian of a truth that could change the world, and I would not let Grandpa down.